more than 50 participants. So we can start. Very good afternoon to all of you. Just wanted to update you what I have uploaded to the course page. If you go here, I activated a small thing called the small quiz, which you can try out. It's based on the few questions on the software process models. Okay, when time permits, you can do, and then now you can attempt. Actually, it's active until the Sunday, the 7th November. So very few questions. You have 2 attempts. You can try twice, and as in a learning activity, basic questions about the MCQ questions. So all the questions are taken from the past papers. So it's easier if you do that. And then I also shared the link for the last week discussion on the software process engineering. And hope you got a chance to go through it, or at least to go through the slides, lecture slides of unified process, open unified process. I presented to explain you how the practically software process engineering is carried out. Okay, more than a model. So it's kind of a very famous model and active. However, it has become an academic model now because very few people are practically using it. However, still the features are very good. You can understand the basic. Anyway, the people can use that model, customize any person or organization according to the requirement of that. And also we discuss about some of the process improvement, how it could be done. And also I shared this chapter. You can have a look at on that one. So both. So that's all about the software process engineering. And today I'm moving to the other section, is the software requirement engineering and management. So this is also very important, and I have now activated almost 3 videos, and hope to will activate the others. There are a few more. But let's do this section in this way. I'll start playing the recorded video, what I have it under the requirement engineering part 1. And sorry, I got some question. Just a minute. Quiz, is it an assignment? Well, quiz is a kind of an activity or assignment that is a part of the continuous assessment. You have to do it. It's a requirement. Then only you will get the required marks assigned. So try to do it. I think it's most important one. Not the number of things correct, but try to do it as much as possible. Questions are not difficult. You will see the answers at the end, and you can try, and it's a requirement. Yes, it will be counted for the continuous assessment. Then another question, Professor. You went for the wrong answers in this quiz. No, there is nothing like that. Okay, nothing. Yes. Do you add those quiz marks to the final grading? Well, under the continuous assessment. So as I told at the beginning, 40% of the marks comes from the continuous assessment. So these activities, and for that, those things will be added. Yes. Okay. So you better to do that one. That's a requirement. So those activities will help you to score more, and the participation of the other activities. Okay, you can use the chat box if you have any question to post here. Okay, then so under the requirement engineering, I think it's important. So I first play the video. Meantime, there may be questions. We get it while going. So just post it on the chat box, and I am happy to take it at the end, or even I will reply to them through the chat box, and I may not have enough time to play everything today. Sometimes I may spend the next week, but this part is very important. We also have to do another assessment activity at the end. So I'll discuss that one most probably the next week. Yeah. When the last day for us to post the comments on the process model discussion. Let me. I think I didn't put in something onto that one. This one, am I correct?
Is that discussion part of the assessment?
Yes, of course.
This one?
Yeah,
This one?
yeah. Okay. This is a part of the assessment. That's why I posted the question. I want you to participate. Yeah. Yes. I didn't put in a date for that one. I didn't want to put in too much, but let's keep this kind of a thing 3 to 4 weeks. Okay. Not for a long period. So we started the thing on the 22nd October. 12th October. So then the calendar wise, let's keep. I didn't put any cutoff date. Let me check. Yeah, I haven't put any cutoff date, but let's keep a 3 to 4 weeks, okay, maximum. And after that, the third week I will close the forum. So otherwise, people may come and start processing or start posting the things even at a later stage. So we can keep this one. Let's make it.
Actually, we have done few comments, but after that 30 minutes, we can't edit that. Can we edit that to make some kind of improvements?
This way, I mean, in the discussion forum, usually you can edit that one during the first 30 minutes. After that, if you wanted to edit, you can't edit, but you can post your corrections for what you have said. That's no problem. Okay. If you have posted something and later you wanted to add something more for it, or if you wanted to correct something what you have already said, you just post another thing. Yeah. So we'll make it since this was started on the 16th, I'll keep this one as the cutoff date, like in November. So then all of you will have enough time now. November 23rd, no problem. So you have almost 1 month. Now this is, I think we started on 16. So let's make it in like 50, 90. That's better. So I save it so you have seen the thing. So find some time to go through before that deadline. That's a part of the activity. Does the number of attempts affect on the marking? No. Highest marks will be given. I mean, in the first one, it's highest marks. Not the first or second attempt, you can get the full marks. That's okay. Yeah. Listener questions are very straightforward, simple question, but you can try the first round and see the score and what are the things wrong, and then you can correct it. Yeah. So with that, let's start for the today's thing. Okay, that is the software requirement engineering. And I'll play the video. That's easier. Okay, welcome to the course Master of Computer Science. The next section, the requirement engineering, one of the very important section in the requirement engineering is the most critical, important requirement for the success of any software engineering project. There are lots to learn. There are lots to practice. Let me know whether you can see the slides now. This section will help you as an
Yes.
advanced learner with some experience of a real software development environment to look at the practices, issues, matters. So I invite you to go through the content at the same time, think critically by looking at the based on your experience and participate in the discussion forum, sharing your experience. Well, let's begin the discussion asking the question, what is a requirement? How do you say? In a simple terms, someone could say it is a need to be satisfied. When I say it is a need to be satisfied, this could be described in several different ways. One way is to describe a condition or capability needed by a user to solve the problem or achieve an objective. When I say the next one, a condition or capability that must be met or processed by a system or system components to satisfy. Uh, these two types of the same requirement. The first one we discuss or we define from the user's point of view. The second one we define or we describe from the system point of view. Most of the time what you see is in a document representing a condition or capability linked to the first or second one. So this is what we see. So a same requirement could be described or presented in two different ways. First one from the user's point of view, second one from the system point of view. And naturally, it is easier for us to start from the user's point of view. And even the use case diagrams, what you know, it's most of the time is based on this point, the user's point of view. However, that is not enough for if we really want to implement a system. We need to expand these requirements and describe them more precisely. Or that is what we call system point of view. There are some references I would like you to watch and read them. These are based on the Ivan Sommerbili's book, the 10th edition. There are lots of free resources which you can. You can also find lots of other resources and share those things. Here are a few things about the requirements. If I look back about the life cycle of a requirement, what we can see uh, at the beginning, there is a need. That is the kind of a reason to initiate or identify something as a requirement. When there is a requirement, the second stage that will create a problem. So when you have a problem, we have to find a way to fulfill the requirement. So that is the second stage. Then third stage is the kind of a solution. The solution is proposed. It's a specific way of satisfying the requirement or need. It's the kind of a thing what we table in order to overcome the problem. Well, at the same time, what we can see, I mean, based on your experience, you can also explain a requirement may trigger several other requirements. So most of the time we may start with one requirement, but when we start analyzing, when we start gathering more details, that will lead to many other things. So uh, when we have many requirements, then that's create a big problem. So how do you link these requirements? Are they related or not? And finding a solution for requirement uh, may not be also easy. One solution may be for one requirement. Do you like to have one solution that will satisfy all the requirements? And the most other interesting thing is the conflict of the requirements. That will also create in the most of the time. And well, when I say user requirements, it should not be a one person, one individual.
there are several peoples who represent the user. So it's the requirements may be spread among them. The same requirement may appear in a different way. At the same time, some requirements may not be requirements of some other users. So that is also another thing what we can start when we uh, investigate the requirements around the system. Well, this factor, the design also should be say what is the design and how this is the design is related with that. Usually we say a design is a kind of a solution. Is that? Well, I would say it is a representation of the solution. The solution for a particular requirement, there may be several solutions. Then the challenge is to identify the correct solution. And that's also requires a lots of things. Well, whenever we identify the requirements, when we present the solutions, we should not go to a status like a mission impossible. Usable representation of a requirement and the design is very, very important and critical. Before moving into details about the requirements, later in the course we discuss in detail about the agile. I have already discussed on the unified process, but this is not a new term. I guess all of you are experienced learners in the course. So what is an agile? So how the agile methods link with the requirements engineering? What we can see in today's context, many agile methods argue that producing a detailed system requirement is a waste of the time as the requirements change so quickly. Do you agree with that? Yes. The requirement has some limited time. Sometimes a requirement may not be a requirement in the requirement what you have today may not be a requirement in the future. And at the same time, requirements document is therefore always out of the date. So you have to read the requirement document looking at the date and last verification or review date. So in the agile approaches, methods usually use the incremental requirements engineering. And we may express requirements as a user stories. That is the most popular technique people use to gather or capture and analyze the requirements using user stories, which we will discuss later in detail. Well, it's good. Agile is very popular. We practice, but as in a discipline in software engineering, this is a practical for business system, but a problematic for systems that require pre-delivery analysis, a critical system or systems developed by several teams. So in a large system, critical systems, there are many people involved. Having a good requirement analysis, requirement engineering, following the requirement engineering process is very, very important. Well, the other things is people, it comes to their minds is the types of the requirements. Now the user requirement and the system requirements is a representation of the requirement from the different two viewpoints. Well, this is not a new term, functional requirements, which typically focus on what the system and identify the functions and the data related requirements. The other one we call the non-functional requirements. That is the opposite. Okay, focus on how well aspect the systems and identify attributes like. I'll discuss these two things a little bit in detail. But my question is, are there any other requirements which are not into these two categories? So we will discuss. So theoretically, this is like in a 1 and 0. You can't have something in between. But that is not the case in the real world analysis. And at the same time, someone could ask, which one is more important? Without going into detail, people say the functional requirements are critical and important. But what about the non-functional requirements? Are they not important? Well, I would say the non-functional requirements are the critical things. If they are absent, if they are not there, then having the functional requirements is meaningless. Are they really related or not? Few of the non-functional requirements factors are given here before I go into the other details. Okay, let's discuss some details about the functional and non-functional requirements. The functional requirements are introduced by the Sommerville in this way as statements of services the system should provide, how the system should react to a particular inputs, and how the system should behave in a particular situations. So it's very clear a functional requirement is something that you can observe, you can use in a particular system. And always whenever we see in a functional requirement, there is a limitation, what it can do and what it cannot do. So this is what we define as a scope. So some output will be able to see, especially in a functional requirement. On the other hand, the non-functional requirements, what you can see, it's a kind of a constraints on the services or functions offered by the system, such as the timing constraints, constraints on the development process, and standards, etc. So that's define a set of things to be satisfied whenever functional requirements is happening. So sometimes people don't do this analysis. Most of the non-functional requirements could be linked with the functional requirements. If you list all your functional requirements, number them, and also list the non-functional requirement, and you can make a separate analysis to see the relationship. If a particular non-functional requirement seems to be in a very related to the all many of the functional requirement, what does it mean? It is a more important. In other words, the priority of the non-functional requirement will be high. So most of the time, so we see that they apply to the whole system rather than individual features or services. That's the another thing usually, but the importance could vary with respect to the functional requirements. Well, this is related to the what I told you in the earlier, whether there is something in addition to the functional or non-functional requirements. And we talked about the functional requirements, non-functional requirement with respect to a particular objective or scope. And however, there may be things which are not directly say as a functional or non-functional. It's a requirement which you cannot neglect. Those requirements come from the domain where the application is situated. Now, for example, if there is a system that we have to develop for an educational institute like at the UCSC Higher Education Institutes, there are things which are constraints, which are functions or functional or non-functional, and not directly with respect to the application, but in a part of a common requirement that because of an educational context of the institute. The same thing if you have to develop a system for a hospital, and these health systems and health practices, rules, regulations may not be a directly part of the but something has to be considered. So it's a good if you can separate, if you can identify this type of a constraints. I don't want it to say domain constraints are subset of a non-functional requirements. Sometimes they may be a functional requirements, but most of the time people see them as another subset. So some of the things, if it is in a functional requirements, you usually be able to describe functionality. or the service that it could be provide, and depend on the type of the software, expected users, and the type of the system where the software is used. So those things should be able to say. Functional user requirements may be high-level statements of what the system should do. So as I told you, that is the point where we start, but more precisely we have to describe. When at the user requirements level, it may not be precise, but when it goes to a system level, yes. So this, the precision is also an important thing which we'll discuss later. Functional systems requirements should describe the system services in detail. So yeah. So this is related to precision. So in other words, can we say the requirement clearly, precisely? Most of the time, this is the problem that is associated when we try to describe the requirements. And as a result, what will happen, the requirement may not be clear. We call ambiguous. Requirements may be interpreted in different ways by the developers and the users. So if it is not very clear, it is not very precise, one person may describe it in a one way, another person may describe or understand in another way. So as a result, there is a misunderstanding. The way it will be implemented also may be in a different. So here is in a simple example, a search. So in a search requirement, in a, let's say in an application like in a medical thing, search for a patient name across the all appointments in all clinics. So the user may define it like that, but it's in a very high level abstract requirement. But at the system level, the developer may say it as a search for a patient name in an individual clinic. User chooses the clinic, then search. So more precise. So user requirement and system requirement is a good example. But when we try to say it precise, what has happened? It's mapping to some sort of a thing. But there is the precision may have increased, but it may may not be correct with respect to the actual user's intention. Non-functional requirements are also important things, as I explained you. They are critical. I feel they are more important than sometimes the functional requirements. It's something like in a person. If the person has bad qualities, then it is meaningless about his qualification, his capabilities, and other things. I mean, these are sometimes I enjoy comparing the software engineering concepts with the real life concepts. Okay, functional and non-functional requirements. So every person has those two things. So sometimes people have lots of functional capabilities, but if their qualities are poor, then their capabilities are not very meaningful. So here these define the system properties and constraints, and that may be a reliability, response time, storage requirements, constraints, device capabilities, system representation. And process requirements may be also specified, mandating a particular IDE, programming language, or development method. So process requirements, when the people are supposed to do, it's something, a kind of a thing may not be exactly directly related, but in the process of implementing, yes, you need it's something like when you are traveling in a bus uh, in a long distance, you may want it to have a comfortable seat, okay, programming environment when the people are developing things. So non-functional requirements may be more critical than the functional requirements. So that is the earlier thing which I explained to you. If these are not met, the system may be useless. Completeness and the consistency are very important two features. You may have heard these things several times. So I quickly say, and in other words, if a particular requirement is complete and if there is follow the, if we can see the consistency, then it may be, most probably it may be precise. So both these things are important. Complete means they should include the description of all facilities required. Consistency means there should be no conflicts or contradictions in the description of the system facilities. So as I told you, the common problem when we have many requirements, the contradictions, okay, you say you need this, at the same time you say another thing which is contradict with your previous thing. So if there is no contradiction, so it's consistent. So we always check the consistency with respect to the other things what we have identified. In practice, because of the system and environmental complexity, it is impossible to produce a complete consistent requirements document. So that is the practical reality. So however, even though it is difficult, there may be, we have to move for that. So with respect to the non-functional requirements may affect the overall architecture of the system rather than individual components. So later we will discuss when we talk about this software architecture section in the course. Non-functional requirements are critical things which provide the good input to identify the system architecture. So this is also related to the viewpoints. So ensure the performance requirements are met. You may have to organize the system to minimize the communication between the components. So that will help people to identify the most suitable architecture. A single non-functional requirement, such as a security requirement, may generate a number of related functional requirements that define the system services that are required. So this is another trick. I mean, as we observe, why we say the requirement engineering is very difficult, because people don't know their requirements. People cannot describe their requirements. But you may not be able to identify all the requirements. But however, the things that you have identified, if you start analyzing, you will be able to identify the missing requirements. That may be from functional or non-functional. But most of the time, when you start analyzing the non-functional requirements, you may see the gaps. Those are the kind of important functional requirements that you may have failed to identify. So this generates the requirements that restrict existing requirements. In the today's context, people, since it's important, they classify the non-functional requirement in 3 different ways. First one called the product requirements, where the requirements which specify that delivered product must behave in a particular way. Okay, example, execution speed, reliability. Then the other thing is what we call organizational requirements, and requirements which are consequences of organizational policies and the procedures. Example, process standards, used, implementation requirements. So the separation of the functional requirements to that 2 levels, that will help us to analyze, process and build. External requirements, totally outside. Requirements which arise from factors which are external to the system and its development process. Example, interoperability requirements, legislative requirements, etc. So this 3 types of 3 grouping is very, very useful. Now, if we analyze these 3 requirements, non-functional requirements, product requirements, you will be able to see several things. For example, usability requirements, efficiency requirement, dependability requirement, security requirements, performance requirements, space requirements. So that is where you can further expand from that and try to see under the product requirements, you can try to identify the respective things. And you can use the environmental, operational, and development factors with respect to the organization to identify the organizational non-functional requirements. And the other one, external requirements, regulatory, ethical, legislative, that may be accounting or safety matters. So this is a very good way of exploring the possible non-functional requirement. And then later you will have to identify the priority list of these non-functional requirements and their relevance, and those things are very important thing, which is really very hard process. So here is another kind of a matrix that will help you where you can use it. There are lots of more. I have selected from the Somavides book some of the things, kind of measures which you can use to identify the details with respect to the different functional requirements.
So I received a few questions. Yes, sorry, it was over. So let's discuss some of the key points what we discussed there. The one question is about this domain requirement. Is it a functional requirement or non-functional requirement? How do you classify or how do you identify that? Well, you may have also heard something called the domain analysis. Usually in the software engineering, that is also discussed. When a project is started, when a project is officially going to start, organization should carry it out this the requirement analysis, what we call the domain analysis is known as. The main objective is to, as I explained in the video, so to some extent to gather some of the additional thing, and then the people they understand some of the factors that are affecting for the functional requirement. In that case, there may be some of the things will be non-functional, some other things may not be non-functional. For example, some cases, you may remember there was something called the organizational requirement. Okay, most probably that may be things that you could identify. It is possible to have some functions or even some functionalities may need to be developed depending on the specific case. Functional requirements may have some effect. We can't say there is an only for the non-functional requirement. Okay, that is the suggestion. If you have a different experience, I'm very happy to hear about that. So this is a very important thing to start the discussion. And now, any other question, anything before we start talking about some other stuff? Now, functional requirement, as you can see, they also describe from the user's point of view as well as a system point of view. Okay, people could ask the question, which one do you do first? For example, as it's mentioned, the user requirements is the something that we start, but then which way that you really write the functional user requirement, a functional requirement. So people in a common base write in the natural languages, some kind of language where even the non-technical people can understand. That is very, very important. And some of these user requirement will be in a very high level thing, which may have will have to split into several functional requirement at the system level. So that is also a kind of a challenge, and there may be some user requirements may not be very clear. That is also a possible thing that what we can see. So unclear functional requirement as a user requirement, it's possible to identify, but they may have to identify it when system requirements, so the system level functional requirements are developed. Okay, so writing the requirement is also is a very challenging thing. Okay, sometimes people do this mapping with respect to the mapping of the user requirement and what are the corresponding the system requirements. Okay, there may be several. That mapping also will help the people to identify whether they have clearly captured all the requirements. So those things people can do in some requirement management tools. If you have experience of using, they also provide this kind of facilities. And so the group, there may be some people, for example, user requirement and the system requirements. If we consider, both will be visible, and probably the system requirements are required for the actual identification of the cost, as well as to define the agreement between the development party and the client. So at the initial level, the user requirements, people may work on that thing. So the different users may come. I mean, the user group may be quite different, and the user requirements are now, for example, end users, as well as end users, and also the client are more concerned about the user requirements, but the system requirements, we have to present them, but may not be, they may not be able to understand. So stakeholders, so their involvement are also important. Then I also discuss about some of the things with related to this agile methods and the requirement. So very kind of the model idea is what people talk about this. If you have, remember what is called incremental requirement engineering. Okay, incremental requirement engineering means what? So there are people will not identify all the requirements at once. They will gradually collect the requirements, the details of the requirements in that process. Okay. Yeah. So, any other question? Anything that you would like to ask on the functional requirements before we move into the other thing? Big picture of the functional requirements are also, I discuss about this. For example, product level requirements, organizational requirement, external requirements, and at the same time, I mean, having a good numbering mechanism, as I just mentioned in the chat box when it was played, kind of a good numbering thing is very, very important, because later you realize the traceability could be easily implemented if you have it. And also always the mapping are very, very important. Wait a second. Yes, I will share the slides. I started talking without looking even at my slides, so I just wanted to do, but let me, then it will be very useful for you if I do this one. There was a question. Yeah, so product requirements is that what I really mentioned. Wait a second, something went wrong with the slide share. Okay. Yes. Hope you can see the slides, okay? Okay. is there isn't a question. Authentication and authorization isn't a functional requirement, but security is a non-functional requirement. Okay. Now, authentication. What do you mean by the authentication? Authentication is even the login into the system isn't a part of the action the user is doing. It's a functional requirement. So that should be satisfied. Okay. And that is where must be a precondition to satisfy it. And in order to do the some of the other function, so which in other words, the authorization happen only if the person is logged into the system. So this is the point where, if you remember in the discussion I talked about, a requirement could trigger several other requirements. So the requirement, some of the things could be mapped to, you can see the relationship. So functional requirements, if you looked at the whole big picture, they are again, it's not the same. So so this authentication, authorization, which will be given, yes, it usually comes as a functional requirement. Now, when you say the security, we may describe in a different way. Security, sometimes we may describe even the granting the permission to access something also isn't a kind of a security requirement. But on the other hand, now if I say a login function, okay, authorization function, if the person has to follow the secure protocol, well, there it is non-functional requirement. So the most of the time, a condition that should be satisfied during the execution of the functional requirement. Okay. Yeah. Just a second. What will be my next one I was talking about?
Let's begin the discussion on the requirement engineering.
Requirement engineering part.
So
Let's
if we ask
have
the
a discussion.
open question, what is the requirement engineering? It is a kind of a process where we are trying to establish the...
Wait a second. I'll share the thing. Just a second. Let's play. I hope. Yeah.
Let's begin the discussion on the requirement engineering. So if we ask the open question, what is the requirement engineering? It is a kind of a process where we are trying to establish the link between the services that customer requires from a system and the constraints under which it operates and it's developed. And if we also look at the system's requirements, description of the system services and the constraints that are generated during the requirement engineering process. You may remember there are two things where the user requirements are the things that we have to gather, but in order to develop the system, we really need to convert them into a system requirement form. So one of the key important requirement is to convert this user requirement into system requirements format in order to facilitate the development. If we graphically look at the whole process, you will be able to see here 4 phases where we will discuss in detail in this section. The requirement engineering process starts with the feasibility study, where feasibility report is a kind of an output of the feasibility study. And sometimes this is conducted outside the requirement engineering process, depending on the project. Sometimes it's a part of the initial phase of the requirement engineering process. The important first stage is the second one, where the requirement elicitation and analysis is carried out. And that is where people need to do a lot of labor work, gathering details, and from that people build their initial models, okay, uh, about the system to be developed. This will help. Will help people to specify the requirements. Well, this is not on a one after the other, as you can see in the diagram. Requirement specification is the third phase, but both are conducted in a parallel way. And not only those two, even the validation, the fourth one also will be done in a parallel way. So it's a there are overlapping activities comes from these three areas. Each phase will provide a kind of an important outcome, what we call the work product, which will help the people to carry out the next phase more easily. Third, requirement specification will help the uh, develop the user and the system requirements, and that is what we really required for the producing the requirement documentation. If we look at the whole picture from a spiral view, where you will be able to see the topology of what we really do in the requirement engineering process, uh, we start the thing with some sort of a business uh, specification, as you can see here. That is the kind of a source for people to carry out the feasibility study. So feasibility study is the requirement validation. So when the business requirement specification may be available or may be defined at the very beginning in the inception phase, or inception phase may covers both the feasibility study in some cases. Requirement validation is what you can see here. So then that is the, once you know the more background, we will discuss the details later. Requirement elicitations commences, and which leads for people to start working, so gathering process of the requirements, and will help the people to define what we call the user requirement specification. Then once you know the user requirement specification, to get an assurance that they gather the correct set of a user requirement, a prototyping will be a very useful tool for people to develop or work on that one. And the prototyping, once the people have the prototype, the system requirement specification can be identified in a more clear way. So sometimes this part people don't consider as important, or they may skip this part and they may jump to this one depending on the type of project, and if they are quite sure about the user requirements, and they can start working on the system requirement elicitation. And that is then the next output of that will be to specify the requirement specification, system requirement specification and modeling, which is in a kind of a thorough analysis of what the people have gathered from user's point of view as well as the system point of view. So combining these things, the people will do it. And at the same time, the validation, which includes the kind of reviews, are very important to finally document the system requirement document, or what we usually call the SRS, system requirement specification. So the whole process we will discuss in detail these stages in this section, and uh, I will skip the prototyping discussion, since we have already discussed about the prototyping in the previous section, but the other sections I will discuss in detail.
Let me say a few words about what I explained to you about the spiral view of the requirement engineering process, which is very important. And this shows the the full view. I mean, if you looked at the whole these things where the people start with the user requirements, even before the user requirement is the business requirement specification, is even where people describe from the business point of view what the people really want. It's the organizational level kind of a thing, what the people want to do. Then the feasibility study is carried out, whether it is practical to do. There may be a different types of the feasibilities the people carry out. I hope that you know them, and we will have some more details later where people wanted to identify the return on investment. But this spiral indicates the same thing. People go around and round to understand the things more clearly, as you can see there, where people validate and describe them in a more details until they come out with what we call the system requirement document, or SRS, or common term, software requirement specification, because that is the most important outcome of the whole process in order to do it. Yes. Yeah. There is a question in the spiral view, where does the design happen? Well, still we haven't started the design. Okay. Now, if you carefully look at what is the difference between requirement and design. In the requirement is we are trying to say what we really need. Okay. Not how. The design is the where, how we'll do it. So people don't want, even this prototyping is not only design, it's the validation thing. And why we are spending such an, I mean, the more big effort to do this one, because we know this is the hardest point. Most of the projects fail at this level. Later they discover, I mean, it will be very difficult to change many things, and should be very clear, because what the users or client says is not what will happen, and they become a completely different thing. If I share with you one small experience I had in the last year, well, this is not a kind of a thing at the UCSC. Our administration doesn't have a stores management system. So what I did, I got some students on their group project to do develop a small system for the stores management, and our administration people didn't have much idea about it. Okay, so I am the product owner in that internal project, and we develop, and I mean, I also wanted to take it into the real development and to implement the system. But what happened, I mean, when the students started developing the system, they didn't call it as a prototype. They developed the system once they identified the requirements. I mean, the stores management system is not a big thing. It's almost very easily can define the requirements. There is no big issue there, but that's what we usually feel. But when we finished they implemented within some functionalities, then what happens? Our administrative people, my Bursa and the other administrative staff in the finance division, after looking at, they start coming up different sets of requirements. Okay, they wanted to say this should be in this way, this should be, and they were very interested and very happy about it. But then, I mean, the project became a totally, I mean, they cannot implement because of now the people are saying a lot of things, but those students never designed for all of them, and even modifying those, some of the things are not possible. So then it came, this spiral model is really practical, what I felt. I mean, what they did as a part of the student project became a kind of a prototype, and the prototype trigger lots of things. I mean, it's not a fault of this the administrative staff, and they didn't know how. I mean, hypothetically they say, but when they see some working system, small systems comes, lots of things triggered, and they started so requirement elicitation resulted a completely different specification. I mean, then I mean, I will have to find another group of students to redevelop the whole system from the beginning, because now I think we have a better understanding about the whole requirement of the stores management system at the UCSA. So I also didn't expect it will happen in that way. But this is what really happens in the real development. Most of the time, people can't go back. Then they do some quick patches to the whole thing, what they have designed, but then it becomes a unstable system at a long run. So if you really want to get a very stable system, uh, important to have a kind of a prototype, at least in the key functions, overall thing, how it works. It's a very important thing to do this elicitation and the validation and before coming with the real requirement. Okay, so I'll continue the other thing. So meantime, if you have any question, you can post it, no problem. Okay. Yeah.
We have already discussed about the prototyping in the previous section, but the other sections I will discuss in detail. First, I would like to say a few things about the feasibility studies and, well, kind of a revision. Most of you may have already know what is the feasibility study. There are many reasons for conducting the feasibility study. Feasibility study decides whether or not the proposed system is worthwhile to do it. That is the main key objective, why we want to really do a feasibility study. In sometimes it is not the people who are going to do the development work. People will want to get a third party, external party, in order to avoid a kind of a bias recommendation coming out from a feasibility study. So it's a short focus study that checks the system contributes to the organizational objectives, and if the systems can be engineered using the current technology and within the budgets, that's a very, very important piece of information required to make the decision whether to move forward with the proposed project. If the system can be integrated with the other systems that are used, otherwise the whole investments will be useless. If they cannot be integrated, there may be a lot of operational problems in the future. So these are the three objectives, what we say a focus behind the feasibility study. Now, there may be lots of different types or categories of the feasibility studies. Some are maybe about the technology or system feasibility, where people are trying to do. Maybe technical experts will do work on the first one, economic feasibility or return on investments. I hope that you may have learned those things in other courses in detail. It's a very, very important factor where cost-based study, time-based study will be carried out. Legal feasibility depends on the context, whether people will be able to get the approval from the external parties, depending on the different context. For example, in the today's context, the data security as well as the protecting the privacy of the users, if there are lots of end users are involving. Operational feasibility, again looking at the thing from the organizational point of view, and scheduling feasibility related to the timing, well, whether they will help the overall schedule of the organization. Market and real estate feasibility, it depends on the kind of a matching what will come out, because as we all know, the things are changing. Not only the requirements in the business context is also changing. That must be considered in the feasibility study when people do it. Resource feasibility here will discuss whether adequate resources are available, whether they will be able to work with that. Sometimes people have a nice systems, but there are no people in the organization to use the system. So that will also create a kind of a problem. So the good investments are not being used properly. Cultural feasibility, whether the people who are working in the organization are capable to take over or work or use the systems. So that is the way most of the time people are looking at. So economical feasibility and the financial feasibility are linked here. The more on the financial feasibility, people are thinking about the return on investment part more than the cost or time-based study, whether the investment will bring something back to the organization or not. So these are the kind of different ways of looking at the feasibilities. So I'm not going into details, but since you are advanced users, I hope that you may have learned these things in a different context. So here is a small exercise. I would like you to do it, kind of a small reference if you have the time to go through, and you can see the kind of the samples details on this reference, and there are some other things. Please use the discussion forum to show your learning reflection on the feasibility studies and reporting feasibility studies. Okay, I'll move to the little bit more discussion about the requirement engineering.
Before that, I like to say something. It just came to my mind. I put it that question to all of you. The relationship between the feasibility and the risk analysis. I hope both terms is known to you. How do you see the relationship between these two things? Anyone willing to say something? How what is a risk analysis? Risk analysis is and the feasibility study. Are they related, or is there any connection between these two things? Can someone say, is there any effect on the risk analysis if we do the feasibility study, at least if I ask in that way? The main reason of conducting the feasibility study is to, in fact, to minimize the possible risks that could be happen, because all these factors, if you carefully looked at, where we are trying to do a kind of an estimate of the different risks and minimize them. Okay. The biggest thing people expect in return on investment, I mean, why they are putting a lot of money, they need to get some value addition to the whole business, not only recovering the cost, but also the value addition will give more opportunities for the business, and that will also expand the other thing. So it's the so people will be in a better position to manage the risk in the project if they have done a feasibility study. So it should be unbiased and also should show the real ground level situation. Okay, so let's continue the discussion.
So once again, if we look at it's the kind of an establishment and the use of sound engineering principles. So sometimes people ask why we call this as a requirement engineering, and some earlier in the previous books, lots of people call this a requirement analysis and design. The main reason is the application of the engineering principles to gather, analyze, document, review. Software requirements can be called software engineering. It's a challenging task. It's not an easy task. It's a harder and the most difficult task, if I say, it will be the thing. Generally, the whole process, even if you see the several four phases, there are mainly two phases where people work on. The first phase where people are trying to define what is the requirement. That's the establishment part. And the second one, since the requirements are subject to change, it's a very, very important to manage them. This stage, the management part, people will have to do it. Uh, may not be after the requirement definition, so people will have to start at an early stage. But the requirement definition, we will first discuss in detail and then go back to the requirement management part. Well, in the requirement definition, there are four sections where people usually discuss. The first one, the volume-wise, the biggest one, elicitation or gathering the requirements, which has several sub-phases where I will discuss later. The second phase is the once you have the gathered, it doesn't make any sense if you put them all these things into the one picture. So analysis and modeling, where you can use different techniques, different tools to carry out the analysis and modeling. Modeling will help the people to identify the missing requirements. The third one is the put them into a kind of a formal document, which is a very, very critical because the requirement analysis will be carried out by the group of people who are not the people who are usually develop the system. So here the requirements that are gathered and modeled are put together in a document, or typically known as the SRS. So we will see the documents, and then finally this is a continuous process during the uh, design and development, as you can see in the unified process, where the review consists of the SRS by all stakeholders. So where we wanted to get their different viewpoints on here. I'll discuss about the viewpoints later. The reviewed and the approved SRS forms the basis for the work product to be created in the latter parts of the software life cycle. So that will have, even SRS is the kind of a blueprint, but the review will help the people to have a different version of the SRS. So let's discuss those four things in detail, but we'll first go to the first one in detail. And before I move to the discussion of the first part, well, management areas, there are basically two. Change management. This involves the systematic handling of the changes agreed to the requirement during the course of the project. So how do you really make the modification to the SRS? And every request should not be considered to modify the SRS. So there should be some sort of a approval body, what we call approval body, who will give a green light to make the changes to the SRS. Requirement traceability is a very, very important thing to validate whether they have covered all the requirements, and also to validate whether people are on the right track or not. So this consists of maintaining the traceability requirements between the agreed and the SRS and the work products like design documentation, test plans, created downstream in the software lifecycle, upstreams to origin of a requirement as well. Backward traceability. So anytime when some people want to do it, they wanted to go back, okay, what is the original user requirements which is referred for this kind of a work, how these things are developed. So otherwise this becomes initially things will be very simple, but with evolution it becomes the tough assignment. So requirements management activities start after the requirement review is complete and the document is baseline. So that is what usually happen, kind of a phase thing. But yeah, before the baselining, usually people don't think about it's a management part. Still, they can make the modification to the SRS. So SRS 1.0 is a baseline document in most of the cases where people take it to this level. Okay, let's start the discussion about the very first phase, requirement elicitation, which is in a kind of a communication process that involves several parties, stakeholders, and that communication may happen in a different ways, as I will explain it later. Maybe people initially will have meetings, interviews, and the discussions, observations, things like that. Uh, through the elicitation primarily takes place at the start of the project. So it is something, the element of the elicitation takes place throughout the life cycle. So it is not a one-time communication where people wanted to have this continuous dialogue. As a result, it is possible new proposed during the design and the implementation, new requirements could be proposed. At the same time, existing requirement may be modified or and deleted. That also could be happen. And another thing, before you start the discussion, if you don't know the background, that will also create a kind of a problem. This is where the people are talking about the importance of fact finding. The fact finding, it's to, you first need to know the background, and that consists of the study of the organization, not specific to uh, the project. It's about the organization in which the target system will operate or define the proposed system scope. And here, the problem scope definition activities involved in these tasks are vague and open to interpretation. It is best to have all the affected parties participate in the stage, including the users, developers, and the sponsors, to promote the shared ownership. Uh, the kind of bringing people together before you start the communication, and know about them, know their background, why they are interested, what is the interest of the organization, and this part has to be done by some people. And if everyone involved agrees upfront to the scope of the system, and stability of the requirements can be minimized. So this is an important matter that people really need to think about in the fact finding. So some details are given in the fact finding process. Identification of the relevant users across the multiple levels of the user organization. So there may be user categorization, and then identification of the analyst with relevant domain and technical experts. Sometimes we call this one as a identify the focus group, because it is a very difficult to communicate with all the people in the organization, but having a focus group which consists of the different types of users will help the people to have a good dialogue. Determination of the scope and reconfirmation of the scope. So the people who are going to develop the system should make sure that they are going to develop what the people really want. And then identification of the similar systems, if any.
I think there was a disconnection. Let me start it again.
Feasibility study. So feasibility technical. Identification of the domain and the architectural models, conduct of the technological survey for data feasibility studies or risk assessment kind of work. Sometimes people do it. And assessment of the cost implementation constraints imposed by the sponsor. So there may be some things which they will come across when they start looking at the whole context, which is not visible in the feasibility study. So really, when the people want to start the project in the inception phase, people may find. So these things will come out or will carry out during there. And the output will be what we call statement of the problem, context of the scope of the proposed systems, and the overall objective of the target systems, and the boundaries of the interfaces of the target system. In other words, the problem statement should be able to write, and the people will be able to define the set of objectives where they will work and what they will do under those objectives. So in technical terms, we use the scope, the boundaries and interfaces for the target systems. So objective, scope, and the problem statement. Those are the three main output that you should be able to come out in a after the fact finding. Also wanted to mention about the domain analysis. Well, this is where people discuss about the depending on the type of the systems people develop. For example, if you are going to develop a system for UCSC, it's in the educational domain. So there are lots of things due to the domain restrictions, the culture there. If you are planning to develop a system for a hospital and the healthcare sector, which has another domain. So this may not be directly part of the whole project, but very important thing. If the developing team doesn't know nothing about the domain, that will create lots of problem. Based on your experience, you can share in the discussion forum whether it is a really important the domain analysis or not. The process by which the software engineer learns about the domain or better understand the problem, that will help. I mean, without having a domain, and it's very hard to formulate the problem. And domain expert is a person who has a deep knowledge of the domain. So you will have to contact those people, and the benefits of performing domain analysis will be fast development. Otherwise, people will struggle to understand the requirements, and the better systems will come out that will switch for the whole context and anticipation of the extensions. So they know in advance, okay, this will be what will be the future objectives that should be covered under the maintenance. Probably a report could be produced. I'm not going to discuss in details, as you can see with these things. Defining the problem and the scope, as I mentioned, it's something that comes under the very in the fact-finding process. Problem can be expressed as a difficulty the user or customers are facing. So maybe it will be a small paragraph in some cases, and or an opportunity that will result in some benefits such as improved productivity or sales. The solution to the problem normally will entail the developing the software. That's why this kind of thing. A good problem statement, short and succinct. That is, I guess all of you may have some experience, but writing the problem statement is a challenging exercise where people need to have an overall understanding about the problem to be done. Defining the scope, it's critical things which should be done. Well, the scope you cannot define without identifying or without defining the objectives. Narrow the scope by defining a more precise problem. So it depends, and when you wanted to say the boundary, you have to say what is done as well as what will be not done. So most probably within the scope there may be some sub-scope or subsystems people may do it, and outside thing also you will better to identify it or define.
Okay, I have a few questions. I mean, about I just put it on the chat box as you see that. Some of the things already explained in there. I mean, if you looked at the kind of a project, usually people describe this problem statement. That's very important. And aims, objectives, then scope, functional requirements. Okay. So all these things are not isolated things. They should be related to each other. Okay. There should be very clear relationship. Otherwise, very difficult to interpret them. For example, once it is very clear about the functional requirements, the people can say what will be completed. What will not be completed is also very important. That should be defined. So in the scope definition is there, people describe what will not be covered. Okay. So then my question is, what are the objectives? How do you see the relationship between the objectives and the scope and the functional requirement? Any idea? Any report? All these things are very, very critical. How do you think about objectives? And also we have another thing called aim or goals. I may assume that most of you have some idea about how the relationship aim or the goal is in a very high level thing. People may define. Most of the time, by looking at the problem statement, people may define after the problem statement the aim or the goals. But that's not enough to do something. So people need to come to a little bit of a detail. So the objectives are a list of the things that may define under the particular goal. And in principle, we say all these objectives in combination, once you achieved, you reach the goal. SMART objectives, I hope you may have heard, is in a kind of in a way of measuring the progress or the success of completion. And so the functional requirements are the something to be developed and we require, but on the other hand, objectives, it's a good kind of things that people can measure. And in a project plan, the milestones could be easily then identified once you have those objectives defined clearly. Objectives describe, I mean, there's a question, objectives are final outputs. I would say objectives define as something to be achieved. Okay, so in any project, anything, at the end, people have to look back and see whether you have achieved the objectives. That means you have covered the scope. Then you should say all the required functional things, non-functional things should have been implemented. So rather than saying the final outcome, people say the outcome. I mean, in some reports, you may have say people describe as an outcome. Outcomes are what will be available once you reach the objectives. Okay. And common guideline is to write these objectives in a smart way. That means measurable objectives. Sometimes the objectives are not very clear, then very difficult to measure them, or people don't know whether it is clear target or not. The target should be very clear. Objective, in other words, is a target. So it should be very specific depending on the whole work, what will be covered. Yeah. Any other question? I'm happy to answer it.
Okay, let's start discussing about in detail.
Or we look at the next video script, so then we can do it. Yes, let me share it again. Yes.
About the activities that are carried out under the requirement elicitation or gathering. So, as I mentioned earlier, software engineers will have to interact with the different types of stakeholders to find out about the application domain, the services that the system should provide, the required system performance, hardware constraints, and other systems which will be connected, and like so. So the process, the several stages are there, as we can see. The whole requirement elicitation is not one thing. You just go and start discussing. First, in the discussion process, the discovery, we will say. It's usually you will identify the things, and then it's very important once you identify, while identifying, classify them and organize them is a kind of an activity has to be carried out, and identify what are the important thing, priority, negotiation will have to do. The other one should be done in parallel to some extent, and then define the specification with respect to the users with whom the this interaction took place. So those are the four subspace stages that we can see under the requirement elicitation process. Several problems we can observe in the requirement elicitation process. The first one is stakeholders don't know what they really want. So this is must be something that people should have it in mind. Otherwise, people may think they know the problem, and you are trying to. It's not questioning by the law and order authorities to find out a hidden thing. Well, you are interacting with them to identify what they want, but they don't know what they really want. Stakeholders express requirements in their own terms, so it is very important to know that terminology, because if you build your own terminology, especially the technical terminology, some of the people may not able to understand them. Differentiate the stakeholders may have a conflicting requirement. So if you talk to one person and he may given a one picture, and if you talk to another person, the other person will have another picture. So there may be similarities as well as the issues with respect to the two narrations. Organizational and political factors may influence the system requirements. This is one of the biggest challenge that you will be able to see in the requirement analysis process, because people are biased. They talked about their side, not at the same time discuss the existing weaknesses in the organization. So lots of internal problems may come out when people start collecting the requirements from the organization. So it's a socio-technical exercise, and sometimes really very interesting, but very important to keep the track. The requirements change during the analysis process. New stakeholders may emerge and the business environment may change. So you are trying to gather the data from a changing environment. So it's not when you have talked to some people, when you come back to them a few weeks later, the things may have changed a lot. Sometimes the people may have moved to a different section. That's also a kind of then the people may talk about the different aspects. If we put them all these four important things which I mentioned into a picture to get the overall idea, the discovery is the first thing where we start, but that will help the classification and priority building and the specification. It's not one after the other. We'll have to do it in a recursive way several times. That's why it's shown in this way. Process activities, well, it's a process, and the requirements discovery, uh, interacting with the stakeholders to discover the requirements. Domain requirements are also discovered at this stage. So it's not only the user requirements, so they are supposed to do this one.
I like to say something. When I remember some of the very good examples, I thought it may be very useful. Very recently, in a project managed by the UCSC, by some of the academic staff members to a government organization. It's a kind of developing the software or their requirement of managing some of their activities. There was a kind of an additional secretary in that, I don't like to say the name, in the ministry, and based on that, people have developed a SRS, and they developed the software. And well, somewhere after the first stage, I remember they went and presented, but then a new additional secretary was appointed, not the previous person. And the new additional secretary didn't agree with what was presented. He had a completely different ideas. Then there was an issue, and the team as well as the ministry officials wanted to have a meeting with me. And the our team said that they have done an SRS, they have agreed with an SRS, they have signed that thing. Then the new additional secretary then presented and say that all their requirements are misunderstood, and the previous person has given a wrong information. And although they have signed that one, they cannot accept. So this is a real thing that happened in a few months ago. I mean, almost 2 months ago, this happened. And they want a kind of a solution from me. I mean, then people, after doing all the implementation work, now they wanted to change it completely. So the development team said they have to redo the whole work. I mean, finally, I had to ask, yes, even though they have signed what we call the sign off the relevant documents, we can't say, no, you have agreed, you have to accept this one, because in the real context, we have to change it again. So the important lesson I told the other team, even though people may be happy to put their signature, but they will not take the responsibility. So the development team should have been very should be in a very confident to validate these things from different sources, not on a few people who will involve in the project, because otherwise there may be some problem. So this is a good example where when the people change, the requirement change. So in other words, the requirements are something that depends on the people. And so need to have a good understanding on that one. Okay, we'll listen to the rest of the things as we have a few more minutes, but I'll do that one.
Because not because of they want, but they are supposed to do. Requirement classifications and the organization means here, I'm giving in a details about the 4 stages which shown in the previous slides. It's the group the requirements and organize them into a coherent clusters, and the priority negotiation where priority requirements and resolving requirements conflicts has to be done. Requirement specification is the kind of an initial document people may come after based on the user requirements that are gathered. Okay, gathering requirements. Okay, here what we do, it capture the information from viewpoints of various users to identify what is to be built. So when I say viewpoints, that is kind of a thing where what the people will see, what the people expect. So based on their expectation, we can classify the people, because what is classified based on the organizational structure may not be directly important in here. So with the scope of the system understood, so that's already when the people start gathering, they know to some extent the scope. The next task is to gather the requirements in more detail. So that's what people really wanted to be focused. So when they see something going out of the scope, must be recorded, that one, because very important to see the boundary. When you want to see the boundary, you have to see the both side in that case. One of a technique which you may know and you may have tried using this wish list approach to categorize the across all levels of the user community and classify wish list according to the functional, non-functional environment and design constraints. So this will help the people to identify items in the wish list within the scope, which are outside the scope. A small technique people could try out when gathering the requirements. And coming to the uh, some more details about how some techniques people could try out. Hope you may have learned about these lots of techniques on the system analysis and design type of course if you have followed. I'm not going into details, but we'll talk about a few things in early stage of the requirement elicitation. It is important to gather as much as information as possible for users, developers, customers through the use of interviews, observations, meetings, group discussions, simulation, and questionnaires. Um, I'll talk about a few things about the interviews. Observation are also very interesting exercise because usually what people say or speak will not be what people really do. So it's ethnographical studies people call it. We'll also do it. Meetings are very important. That means where you bring several people together. In the interviews, people talked about what they really see and what they like, but in a meeting that will help the people to restrict or define what they really want. The group discussions will be based on the different groups which you may have identified, kind of more focused. Maybe even people could use now today's different technologies, uh, groups to have the continuous dialogue. Simulations, well, this involves showing some paper prototypes, okay, maybe in this case. And the questionnaires are very important tool. I hope all of you know. A kind of a user study must be carried out, could be carried out as a part of the data gathering.
I stop from that point, but I just wanted to add a few more things on this requirement gathering. I think these things, all of you may have some experience, but the interviews, when it comes to the interviews, there are several types of the interviews. I hope that you may know closed interviews and the open interviews. That means where you have a predefined set of a question, you bring it and ask people and then record their responses. And open interview, you have a free discussion and where through that. So if someone asks what is the best method, this combination of that where people really know it. Observation are very important because people always do something different than what they say. So ethnographic studies I didn't cover, but it's a very interesting things where people really wanted to observe and then capture what they do it. And this leads to some very interesting thing called the user story, and then scenario and persona. Okay, so this is more towards the user-centered design where people talked about when it comes. And well, the meetings today is also, sometimes people don't talk, but online meetings are different compared to the physical meeting. I think I personally feel online meetings are more productive in some cases. And group discussion, you can have a different brainstorming approaches like that, where you group them different people, and especially when there are political issues in any organization, you see that the group discussions are very important. Simulations, yes, that helps some people to trigger some hidden thing, and the questionnaires also could be carried out, but not asking all their personal details, but very specific questionnaires. Always people hate that answering questionnaires. So you really need to keep putting a large number of questions, wasting time. People usually don't like, but target questionnaires developing are very important. So for the today's discussion, we will stop that point. And if there isn't any question you can post, I'm happy to discuss with you, and we will continue the balance part of this section in the next week or so. So if time permits, you can go to the course page and watch them again, and I will also activate the other the videos of the other parts of this requirement engineering session, traceability, and especially the requirement management part. So we will discuss them and in the same way. Okay. That's the main thing that I would like to say today, but any question, anything, if you want, you can post here. Otherwise, we will finish the session. Okay, with that, I'd like to stop the today's session. Thank you for the participation. Please go through these things. I mean, the one problem is people when they are busy, they don't want to finish the remaining work, and because that is very important to do it. Yes. How can we get the past papers? I think in the VLD there must be a course called the past papers. From that one, you can download all the past papers. I hope it should be there. Let me check. You go to the home. There must be in a section called the past. Yes, there is a something called the, let me show you. So here, past papers. You can get. There was another question I didn't see. So there's a deadline for the forum discussion. Yeah, that's what I just put it. So I activated. You should be able to see. I mean, the not for all. Once I created a forum, I expect within 3 to 4 weeks you have to finish it. Do we need to add the discussion under discussion? Is the requirement in the management forum discussion? No. Well, some of the things are very not compulsory for you to participate. Okay. If it is in a compulsory, I usually describe. So the compulsory thing I have identified. Some other things are not compulsory, but you are welcome to discuss. Yes. Or express your opinion, question, suggestion in sharing some useful information. All these things are. Yes, you can use those forums. Okay, with that, we'll finish the session. So I'll stop sharing. Yeah. Thank you. Stop the recording.